The man known to history as Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904, in New York City. Though even this seemingly straightforward fact carries whispers of controversy, his birth came at a moment when America stood poised between centuries, when the old certainties of Victorian science were crumbling before the revolutionary physics that would reshape reality itself. The son of German Jewish immigrants who had fled European persecution, Oppenheimer entered a world that would both embrace and ultimately betray him, a world he would transform so profoundly that humanity would never again sleep soundly under an innocent sky. Little did anyone know that this child, born into wealth and privilege on Manhattan's Upper West Side, would become the destroyer of worlds, a man who would unlock the universe's darkest secret and spend the remainder of his days haunted by what he had wrought. Julius Oppenheimer, Robert's father, had arrived in America from Germany in 1888 with nothing. Through determination and business acumen, he built a successful textile importing company, accumulating considerable wealth. He married Ella Friedman, a painter from Baltimore, whose family had established themselves in American society generations earlier. The match represented both social climbing and genuine affection. Ella brought refinement and artistic sensibility to the household. Julius brought ambition and the immigrants' hunger for acceptance. Their apartment at 55 Riverside Drive overlooked the Hudson River, filled with European paintings, rare books, and the trappings of cultivated taste. Into this environment of privilege and culture, young Robert, as he preferred to be called, emerged as a peculiar, intense child whose precocious intelligence both delighted and unsettled those around him. From his earliest years, Robert displayed an unsettling brilliance. At age 5, he corrected his grandfather's German grammar. At 7, he was conducting correspondence about mineralogy with adult scientists at the New York Mineralogical Club, who assumed from his sophisticated writing that he was a mature professional. When invited to present a paper, the club members were astonished to discover their correspondent was a child who needed a box to stand on to reach the podium. His bedroom became a laboratory and museum, crammed with rock specimens meticulously labeled and catalogued. He devoured books in multiple languages, teaching himself French and Greek with minimal assistance. His younger brother Frank, born 8 years later, would later recall Robert as simultaneously magnetic and distant, capable of intense focus on intellectual problems while seemingly disconnected from normal childhood concerns. Yet beneath this prodigious intellectual surface, troubling patterns emerged. Robert suffered frequent illnesses that kept him from school for extended periods. Some biographies suggest these ailments were partly psychosomatic, manifestations of a sensitive, perhaps neurotic disposition. He formed few friendships, preferring the company of books and ideas to peers his own age. When he did interact with other children, his intellectual superiority and cutting wit often alienated them. Teachers marveled at his gifts, but worried about his social development. He seemed to exist in a realm of pure thought, uncomfortable in the messy physical world of boyhood games and casual companionship. The Oppenheimer household, despite its material comfort, carried an emotional complexity. Ella suffered from what was likely depression, spending long periods in her room or at sanitariums. Julius, absorbed in business, related to his sons primarily through high expectations and the provision of educational opportunities. The family's Judaism was cultural rather than religious. They attended no synagogue, observed no rituals. This created a certain rootlessness, a sense of being neither fully Jewish nor fully assimilated into Protestant American society. Robert grew up acutely aware of being different, of occupying an ambiguous social position that wealth could not entirely resolve. The early 20th century into which Oppenheimer was born trembled with revolutionary change. In science, the comfortable Newtonian certainties that had governed physics for 2 centuries were collapsing. In 1905, when Robert was barely a year old, a young patent clerk named Albert Einstein published papers that would overthrow classical physics, introducing theories of relativity that redefined space, time, matter, and energy. Max Planck's quantum theory suggested that energy itself came in discrete packets, not continuous flows. The atom, once thought indivisible, was yielding its secrets to researchers like Ernest Rutherford, who discovered the atomic nucleus in the universe was revealing itself to be stranger, more complex, and more powerful than anyone had imagined. Politically, America was experiencing the progressive era, with reformers challenging the excesses of industrial capitalism, while immigrants poured through Ellis Island, seeking opportunity. Europe simmered with tensions that would soon explode into the Great War, that catastrophic conflict that would shatter the old imperial order and create the conditions for even greater horrors to come. American isolationism competed with growing international engagement. Technology was transforming daily life: automobiles, electric lights, telephones, motion pictures. The pace of change was dizzying, exhilarating, and for many, deeply unsettling. For wealthy New York families like the Oppenheimers, this was an era of cultural aspiration. They collected art, attended opera, supported museums and universities. They sought to establish themselves as inheritors of European high culture while building distinctly American fortunes. Education was paramount, not mere practical training, but cultivation of refined sensibility and intellectual breadth. Robert's parents embodied these aspirations, ensuring their son received the finest education available, while encouraging his aesthetic and philosophical development. Robert attended the Ethical Culture School, a progressive institution founded on the principle that ethical behavior stemmed not from religious dogma, but from rational moral philosophy. The school emphasized critical thinking, social responsibility, and the development of the whole person. Its founder, Felix Adler, preached a doctrine of ethical humanism that resonated with the Oppenheimers' secular Judaism. Here, Robert thrived academically, while remaining socially isolated. Teachers recognized him as extraordinary, but worried about his emotional development. He excelled in languages, literature, and science, with equal facility, displaying the kind of broad intellectual range that would characterize his mature work. However, this was only the beginning of a pattern that would define Oppenheimer's life: the combination of extraordinary intellectual gifts with emotional vulnerability and social awkwardness. His childhood experiences of isolation, illness, and cultural ambiguity were forging a personality of remarkable complexity. The boy who could discuss mineralogy with adult scientists but struggled to connect with peers would become the man who could inspire devoted loyalty while simultaneously alienating colleagues with his arrogance. The sense of being an outsider, Jewish but not religious, wealthy but not fully accepted in WASP society, American but deeply European in sensibility, would shape his political sympathies and ultimately contribute to his downfall. In 1922, at age 18, Oppenheimer entered Harvard University, where his intellectual powers would find fuller expression even as his personal difficulties intensified. He arrived with the intention of studying chemistry but quickly expanded into physics, demonstrating a voracious appetite for knowledge across disciplines. Harvard's educational philosophy suited him perfectly. The emphasis on breadth and the gentlemanly ideal of the cultivated scholar-scientist. He took courses in literature, philosophy, and Eastern religions alongside his scientific studies, accumulating enough credits to graduate in just 3 years while maintaining near-perfect grades. His professors recognized him as perhaps the most brilliant student they had encountered, though some found his intensity and arrogance off-putting. Percy Bridgman, the experimental physicist who would win a Nobel Prize, became an important mentor. Under Bridgman's guidance, Oppenheimer encountered modern physics seriously for the first time, learning about quantum mechanics and the revolutionary work being done in European laboratories. The old certainties of classical physics were giving way to a strange new quantum world where particles were also waves, where observation changed what was observed, where uncertainty was built into the fabric of reality itself. For Oppenheimer, who had always felt uncomfortable with the concrete world of ordinary experience, Quantum mechanics offered a kind of validation. Reality itself, it seemed, was fundamentally ambiguous and mysterious. Yet his Harvard years were marked by emotional crisis. He suffered periods of deep depression and anxiety. The intensity with which he approached intellectual work left him exhausted and sometimes incoherent. He had few close friends, though those he did make often found him charismatic despite his oddities. He could quote Sanskrit poetry from the Bhagavad Gita, discuss French literature, and explain the latest developments in theoretical physics with equal facility. This breadth was intoxicating to some, insufferably pretentious to others. He cultivated a deliberate persona, the intellectual aesthete, the suffering genius, the man too refined for ordinary concerns. After graduating from Harvard in 1925, Oppenheimer went to Cambridge University's Cavendish Laboratory, then the world's leading center for experimental physics. This would prove one of the most difficult periods of his life. At Cavendish, he worked under J.J. Thomson and then Patrick Blackett, attempting experimental research for which he had little aptitude. His clumsiness with apparatus, combined with his theoretical brilliance, created friction. He felt himself a failure, unable to master the practical work that seemed to come easily to others. The depression that had troubled him at Harvard intensified. He wrote anguished letters home. There were rumors, never fully confirmed, of a mental breakdown, possibly even a suicide attempt, or an incident where he left a poisoned apple on Blackett's desk. Whether these darker stories are true or apocryphal, it is clear that Cambridge brought Oppenheimer to a crisis point. He sought psychiatric help and was diagnosed with what was then called dementia praecox, though he clearly did not have schizophrenia. More likely, he was suffering from severe depression and anxiety, exacerbated by the gap between his ambitions and his experimental failures. His parents, alarmed, considered having him hospitalized. Instead, a family friend and psychologist helped him understand that his difficulties stemmed partly from attempting work unsuited to his gifts. He needed to pursue theoretical rather than experimental physics. This realization proved transformative. In 1926, Oppenheimer traveled to the University of Göttingen in Germany, then the center of theoretical physics and the birthplace of the quantum revolution. Here he found his intellectual home. Max Born, Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Enrico Fermi, the architects of quantum mechanics, were creating a new physics, and Oppenheimer threw himself into this work with fierce dedication. He displayed an almost supernatural ability to grasp complex mathematics and physical concepts. He published papers at a remarkable rate, making significant contributions to quantum theory, particularly in understanding molecular structure and cosmic rays. At Göttingen, Oppenheimer also absorbed the culture of Weimar Germany, the cafes, the intense philosophical discussions, the sense of intellectual ferment mixed with political instability. He witnessed the rise of disturbing political movements, the economic chaos, the fragility of democratic institutions. Though not yet politically active, he absorbed these impressions, filing them away in his capacious memory. He perfected his German, read widely in European literature and philosophy, and cultivated friendships with European intellectuals. He was becoming truly cosmopolitan, at home in multiple languages and cultures, more European in sensibility than American. Little did anyone know that this period of intellectual formation would prove crucial, not just to Oppenheimer's scientific development, but to his political evolution. The physicist he was becoming, comfortable with abstraction, trained to think in terms of fundamental principles, accustomed to international collaboration, would approach political and social questions with similar habits of mind. The suffering he had experienced would make him sympathetic to other outsiders and to radical political movements that promised to restructure society along more rational and just lines. In 1927, Oppenheimer completed his doctorate with a thesis on quantum mechanics. He was 23 years old and had established himself as one of the most promising theoretical physicists in the world. He received offers from multiple American universities. However, this was only the beginning of his ascent. The question now was how he would use these extraordinary gifts, what kind of physicist and what kind of man he would become. He accepted a joint appointment between the University of California, Berkeley, and the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, an unusual arrangement that allowed him to split his time between the two institutions. This decision would prove momentous. At Berkeley, there was essentially no theoretical physics program. Oppenheimer would have to build one from nothing. At Caltech, he would collaborate with leading experimentalists. Together, these positions gave him unusual freedom and opportunity. Oppenheimer arrived in California in 1929, just as the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. While he remained largely insulated from economic hardship by family wealth, the Depression would profoundly shape the political consciousness of his generation. As unemployment soared and capitalism seemed to be failing, many intellectuals looked to alternative systems, socialism, communism, even fascism, seeking answers to the crisis. Oppenheimer, still largely apolitical, focused on building his research program and establishing himself as a scientific leader. His teaching style was unique and influential. He gathered around him a group of devoted students who called themselves Oppie's Boys. His lectures were dense, difficult, often nearly incomprehensible to those not already steeped in the material. He spoke rapidly, used obscure references, jumped from topic to topic. Yet for those who could keep up, he was electrifying. He introduced American students to the latest European work, creating at Berkeley a center of theoretical physics that rivaled any in the world. He worked his students mercilessly, but inspired intense loyalty. Many of them would go on to distinguished careers, and almost all retained a deep admiration for their difficult, brilliant teacher. In these years, Oppenheimer made significant contributions to astrophysics and quantum field theory. He and his students worked on problems related to cosmic rays, quantum electrodynamics, and nuclear physics. In 1939, he published a paper on massive stellar collapse that essentially predicted the existence of black holes. Though the term would not be coined for decades, his work displayed characteristic brilliance, but also a certain lack of follow-through. He would identify important problems, make initial contributions, then move on before fully developing the implications. Critics suggested he lacked the sustained focus of truly great scientists, that he was more brilliant explainer than profound original thinker. Yet his reputation grew. By the late 1930s, Oppenheimer was recognized as the leading theoretical physicist in America, and one of the foremost in the world. He moved in elite circles, both scientific and social. He cultivated a distinctive personal style, expensive clothes, a pork pie hat, chain smoking, martinis, gourmet food. He collected art, quoted poetry in multiple languages, maintained a ranch in New Mexico where he rode horses through the mountains. He seemed to have transcended his early difficulties, becoming not just a scientist but a cultural figure, the embodiment of the intellectual as assisted. However, beneath this polished surface, Oppenheimer was experiencing a political awakening. As we will see, this would prove fateful. The late 1930s brought dramatic shifts in Oppenheimer's personal and political life that would set the stage for his later prominence and ultimate downfall. In 1936, his mother Ella died after a long illness. Her death affected him deeply, perhaps loosening some of the emotional constraints under which he had operated. He became more engaged with the world beyond physics, more interested in political and social questions. The rise of fascism in Europe, the Spanish Civil War, the persecution of Jews in Germany, these events penetrated even his intense focus on science. His political awakening was catalyzed by a series of relationships. He became involved with Jean Tatlock, a graduate student in psychology and the daughter of a prominent English professor at Berkeley. Tatlock was beautiful, troubled, and a member of the Communist Party. Their relationship was passionate and turbulent. She introduced him to leftist political circles, to discussions of Marxism and class struggle, to the idea that intellectuals had responsibilities beyond their scholarship. Oppenheimer began attending meetings, contributing money to leftist causes, subscribing to radical publications. He was never a Communist Party member himself, at least this was always his claim, but he moved in circles where party membership was common and respected. His younger brother Frank, who had followed Robert into physics and joined him at Berkeley, did join the Communist Party, as did Frank's wife. Several of Oppenheimer's students were members or fellow travelers. His landlady was a party member. He contributed money to Republican Spain, to migrant workers' unions, to various leftist causes. He attended meetings and discussion groups. For Oppenheimer, this political engagement was partly intellectual communism, appealed to his belief in rational planning, and his cosmopolitan disdain for narrow nationalism, and partly emotional. The leftist circles offered community, moral purpose, a sense of being part of a movement larger than oneself. In 1939, Oppenheimer's relationship with Jean Tatlock ended, though they remained in intermittent contact. That same year, he became involved with Catherine Kitty Poynting Harrison, the wife of a fellow physician. Kitty was also politically radical. She had been briefly married to a Communist Party official who was killed fighting in Spain. When Kitty's second marriage dissolved, she and Oppenheimer married in November 1940. It was a complex relationship. Kitty was strong-willed, difficult, an alcoholic. Their marriage would be marked by infidelities, conflicts, but also deep connection. They had 2 children, Peter, born in 1941, and Catherine, called Tony. As Oppenheimer was establishing his personal life, world events were moving toward catastrophe. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Europe plunged into war. In 1940, France fell, and Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. America remained technically neutral, but was increasingly drawn toward involvement. For scientists, particularly those following developments in nuclear physics, there was growing alarm. In 1938, German scientists had achieved nuclear fission, splitting the uranium atom and releasing enormous energy. The implications were obvious and terrifying. An atomic bomb was theoretically possible. Ernest Lawrence, Oppenheimer's colleague at Berkeley and director of the radiation laboratory, was among those who recognized the danger. If Germany developed atomic weapons first, the war and possibly civilization itself would be lost. American and British scientists began organizing to explore the possibility of building an atomic bomb before the Germans could. Initial studies suggested it might be feasible, but would require an unprecedented scientific and industrial effort. In 1941, the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor. The atomic bomb project, given the code name Manhattan Projects, accelerate. Various universities and laboratories conducted preliminary research on different aspects of the problem: uranium enrichment, plutonium production, bomb design. Oppenheimer became involved in theoretical studies of how an atomic bomb might actually work. In the summer of 1942, he organized a secret theoretical study at Berkeley, where a small group of physicists worked through the basic physics of atomic weapons. This was Oppenheimer's first taste of directing a major scientific project, and he discovered he had unexpected talents as an administrator and leader. He could synthesize diverse strands of research, identify key problems, coordinate the work of strong-willed individuals. He displayed not just intellectual brilliance, but strategic vision and interpersonal skill. These talents caught the attention of General Leslie Groves, the Army officer appointed to direct the Manhattan Project. Groves was an unlikely counterpart to Oppenheimer, a blunt, practical engineer with little patience for abstract theorizing or intellectual pretension. Yet Groves recognized in Oppenheimer someone who could bridge the worlds of pure science and practical engineering, someone who could inspire scientists while understanding military necessity. In September 1942, Groves made a decision that shocked many. He appointed Oppenheimer scientific director of the bomb project's central laboratory, which would be built at a remote location in New Mexico. The appointment was controversial. Oppenheimer had never won a Nobel Prize. He had never directed a large project. He was, in Grove's words, a theoretician with no experience in experimental or engineering work, and there was his political background, the communist associations, the radical friends and relatives. Security officials strongly opposed the appointment. Oppenheimer had not even been granted the necessary security clearance. However, Groves overruled the objections. He saw in Oppenheimer qualities that transcended conventional credentials. "He's a genius," Groves said, "a real genius. While Lawrence is very bright, he's not a genius, just a good hard worker. Why, Oppenheimer knows about everything. He can talk to you about anything you bring up." Well, not exactly. I guess there are a few things he doesn't know about. He doesn't know anything about sports. This was only the beginning of an extraordinary partnership between two radically different men united by shared purpose. The site chosen for the laboratory was Los Alamos, New Mexico, a remote mesa in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where there had been a boys' school. Oppenheimer knew the area well from his ranch nearby. It was isolated, easily secured, yet accessible by rail and road. The laboratory would house not just scientists but their families, creating a complete secret community. In early 1943, construction began and scientists started arriving. Oppenheimer threw himself into organizing the laboratory with maniacal energy. He recruited the best scientists he could find, persuading them to abandon their university positions for the duration of the war to work on a secret project in the desert. Many came because Oppenheimer asked them, such was his reputation and persuasive power. Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, under a pseudonym, and dozens of others, many of them destined for Nobel Prizes. It was perhaps the greatest collection of scientific talent ever assembled for a single purpose. Los Alamos presented enormous challenges. Scientists accustomed to academic freedom chafed under military security. Equipment was scarce. The work was incredibly difficult. Dozens of technical problems had to be solved simultaneously. No one knew if an atomic bomb was even possible. Theoretical calculations suggested it was, but theory and practice often diverged. As we will see, this would prove to be a fatal mistake, not in the sense of project failure, but in the sense that success would unleash forces that could not be controlled. Little did anyone know that the intense, driven man organizing this unprecedented scientific effort was simultaneously under investigation by security officers who suspected his loyalty. Throughout 1943 and 1944, as Oppenheimer worked 18-hour days building the bomb, intelligence agents compiled dossiers on his political associations. They tapped his phone, intercepted his mail, followed him when he left Los Alamos. They knew about his pre-war communist connections. They knew about his ongoing correspondence with leftist friends. And they knew about his continuing relationship with Jean Tatlock. In June 1943, during a trip to Berkeley, Oppenheimer visited Tatlock, spending the night at her apartment. Security agents followed him and noted the visit. This would later be used as evidence of his questionable judgment and possible security risk. In January 1944, Tatlock committed suicide, another tragedy in Oppenheimer's already complicated life. He was devastated, but had little time to grieve. The work at Los Alamos was reaching critical stages. The worst was yet to come. By early 1945, Los Alamos had grown into a complete city of over 5,000 people. Scientists, engineers, military personnel, and families, all dedicated to creating the most destructive weapon in human history. Oppenheimer stood at the center of this extraordinary effort, coordinating multiple research divisions, resolving technical disputes, making crucial decisions about resource allocation and research priorities. He displayed leadership qualities few had expected. Scientists who had known him as an aloof intellectual found him transformed engaged with every aspect of the work, from the most abstract theoretical problems to practical engineering details. The project pursued two parallel paths to atomic bombs. One used enriched uranium-235, separated through enormous industrial facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This design was relatively straightforward. Bring together enough fissile uranium quickly enough, and an explosive chain reaction would occur. The second approach used plutonium-239, manufactured in reactors at Hanford, Washington. Plutonium presented greater technical challenges, but also greater explosive potential. Two different bomb designs emerged. Little Boy, the uranium bomb using a simple gun-type design, and Fat Man, the plutonium bomb requiring a far more complex implosion mechanism. The implosion design became Oppenheimer's greatest technical and organizational challenge. To make it work, a sphere of plutonium had to be compressed to supercritical density by surrounding it with conventional high explosives that detonated with perfect symmetry. The timing had to be precise, to within microseconds. It required advances in metallurgy, explosives technology, and electronic detonation systems. Dozens of interrelated problems had to be solved. Oppenheimer coordinated this work with extraordinary skill, identifying the critical path through the technical challenges and ensuring resources flowed where most needed. He also managed the egos and conflicts inevitable when brilliant, strong-willed individuals worked under intense pressure. Edward Teller, the Hungarian physicist who would later become Oppenheimer's enemy, wanted to divert resources to a super bomb, what would become the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer kept Teller focused on the immediate task, while not entirely dismissing his ideas. When military officials demanded impossible schedules, Oppenheimer negotiated realistic timelines. When security restrictions threatened to impede scientific communication, he fought for reasonable accommodations. He became, in effect, a political operator, as well as scientific director. His personal style evolved to meet these demands. The pre-war aesthete who quoted Sanskrit became a man in a pork pie hat and rumpled clothes, chain-smoking as he moved between laboratories, absorbing technical briefings, making decisions. He inspired devotion from most who worked with him, though some found him arrogant and manipulative. His wit could be cutting. When someone presented fuzzy thinking, Oppenheimer's response could be withering, yet he also displayed compassion and concern for his people, intervening to solve personal problems, fighting for better living conditions, defending his scientists against military bureaucracy. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. Not yet, but the seeds were being planted. The Oppenheimer who emerged from the war would be a public figure, celebrated and controversial, a man who had tasted power and influence. The reserve and social awkwardness of his youth had been replaced by confidence and political skill, but his wartime prominence also made him enemies and marked him as a target for those who distrusted intellectuals, internationalists, and former leftists. In April 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died and was succeeded by Harry Truman, who knew nothing about the atomic bomb project until briefed after taking office. In Europe, Germany collapsed, surrendering unconditionally in May. This development raised troubling questions at Los Alamos. The original motivation for building the bomb had been fear that Nazi Germany might develop it first. With Germany defeated, why continue? But the war in the Pacific continued, and American casualties mounted. Military planners anticipated that invading Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese casualties. In July 1945, the bombs were ready for testing. The plutonium implosion design, so complex and untested, required a full-scale test. A uranium bomb test was deemed unnecessary. If it didn't work, there was so little enriched uranium available that wasting it on a test was unthinkable. The test site was a remote stretch of desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, designated Trinity. Oppenheimer chose the name, later saying it came from a John Donne poem, though some speculated darker psychological associations. On the night of July 16, 1945, scientists, military officials, and dignitaries gathered at observation points miles from Ground Zero. The bomb, nicknamed the Gadget, sat atop a 100-foot steel tower. Weather was uncertain. The test was delayed several hours. Tension was almost unbearable. Years of work, billions of dollars, the hopes of ending the war, all concentrated in this moment. Some scientists, including Enrico Fermi, placed bets on whether the bomb would work and how powerful it would be. A few had speculated about whether a nuclear explosion might ignite the atmosphere, destroying all life on Earth. Calculations suggested this was impossible, but who could be certain when dealing with such unprecedented forces? At 5:29:45 a.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion exceeded even optimistic predictions. For an instant, the desert became brighter than the sun. Those watching through dark welder's glass saw a ball of fire that seemed to fill the sky, turning night to day. The light was visible over 200 miles away. The fireball expanded, rising on a column of radioactive debris that formed the now iconic mushroom cloud. Seconds later, the shock wave arrived, a physical blow that knocked men down, shattered windows 20 miles away. The temperature at the explosion's center reached 100 million degrees Fahrenheit, several times hotter than the sun's core. Sand fused into radioactive glass. The steel tower vaporized instantly. The yield was approximately 22 kilotons of TNT equivalent, small by later standards, but vastly more powerful than any conventional weapon. Oppenheimer watched from the control bunker, 10,000 yards from Ground Zero. His reaction became legendary, though accounts vary. He later said he thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Whether he actually thought this at the moment or constructed the memory later is unclear. What is certain is that he recognized the world had changed irrevocably. When others congratulated him, he seemed subdued, almost in shock. Later that morning, he told his brother Frank, "I guess it worked." General Groves, by contrast, was elated. The test proved the feasibility of atomic weapons. He called Secretary of War Henry Stimson. "The doctor has just returned most enthusiastic and confident that the little boy is as husky as his big brother." The military now had the most powerful weapon ever created, and decisions had to be made about its use. Those decisions had been under discussion for months. A committee of scientists and officials had considered targets in Japan. Kyoto, the ancient cultural capital, was initially proposed, but removed after Stimson insisted on sparing cultural treasures. Hiroshima, a military headquarters and industrial city, became the primary target. Niigata, Kokura, and Nagasaki were alternates. The criteria were military significance, urban concentration to maximize casualties, and minimal previous bombing damage, so the atomic bomb's effects could be clearly assessed. Some scientists at Los Alamos and the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, where much Manhattan Project research had occurred, urged alternatives. Leo Szilard, the physicist who had first alerted Einstein to nuclear fission's weapons potential, circulated a petition arguing the bomb should be demonstrated to Japanese officials on an uninhabited island before being used on cities. Others suggested a warning should be given. James Frank, another Chicago scientist, led a committee that recommended international control of atomic weapons rather than their use in war. Oppenheimer's role in these debates remains controversial. He chaired the committee that advised on target selection. He did not advocate against using the bomb. He participated in discussions about maximizing its psychological and military impact. When asked about demonstration detonations, he expressed skepticism that such demonstrations would be sufficiently impressive to force surrender. He later claimed he believed that using the bombs would end the war quickly, preventing the massive casualties of an invasion. But critics have suggested more troubling motivations: scientific curiosity about the weapon's effects, desire to justify the enormous project expenditure, even unconscious desire for revenge against Japan. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city with a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. The immediate blast, heat, and radiation killed an estimated 70,000 people instantly. Buildings were obliterated for miles. Tens of thousands more died in subsequent hours and days from injuries and radiation sickness. The final death toll reached approximately 140,000 by year's end. Survivors, known as Hibakusha, suffered radiation effects for decades. News of Hiroshima's destruction reached Los Alamos. That evening, Oppenheimer addressed the laboratory staff in an auditorium. Witnesses described him as jaunty, clasping his hands above his head in a victory gesture. The assembly cheered. Wine was produced. There was celebration. The bomb worked. The war would end. Their efforts had succeeded. Only later would many of these scientists reckon with what they had created. Japan did not immediately surrender. Military officials argued that while Hiroshima's destruction was terrible, it was not fundamentally different from the firebombing of Tokyo that had killed over 100,000 people in March 1945. On August 9, a second mission was dispatched, originally targeting Kokura, but diverted due to weather to Nagasaki. Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, detonated at 11:02 am, yielding approximately 21 kilotons. Nagasaki's geography, hills and valleys rather than Hiroshima's flat plain, somewhat limited the destruction, but still an estimated 40,000 people died immediately, with the final toll reaching approximately 70. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. World War II was over. The atomic bombs had ended the war, but had also introduced humanity to a new age of existential danger. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Oppenheimer became perhaps the most famous scientist in the world, rivaling even Einstein in public recognition. He appeared on the cover of Time and Life magazines. He was hailed as the father of the atomic bomb, though he found the paternal metaphor disturbing. At Los Alamos, he received standing ovations. President Truman awarded him the Medal of Merit. Universities competed to hire him. He received lecture invitations from around the world. For a man who had spent his youth as a social outsider, this sudden celebrity was intoxicating, yet also unsettling. However, Oppenheimer quickly became uncomfortable with the role of triumphant weapons designer. As the full horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became clear, the images of burned children, the accounts of radiation sickness, the obliterations of entire cities, many scientists involved in the Manhattan Project experienced profound moral crisis. Oppenheimer was among them. In October 1945, meeting with President Truman, he told the president, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, irritated by this display of intellectual hand-wringing, later told an aide, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again." Oppenheimer resigned as director of Los Alamos in October 1945 and returned briefly to Caltech before accepting the directorship of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, Einstein's academic home. The institute was perhaps the most prestigious theoretical research center in the world, a place where brilliant minds could pursue pure research without teaching obligations. Oppenheimer would lead it for nearly 2 decades, but he never returned to serious scientific research. His contributions to physics essentially ended with the war. He had become instead a scientific administrator, policy advisor, and public intellectual roles for which he had unexpected talent, but which would ultimately destroy him. In the early post-war years, Oppenheimer emerged as a leading advocate for international control of atomic energy. He headed the committee that produced the Acheson-Lilienthal report, proposing that nuclear materials and technology be controlled by an international authority to prevent an arms race. This plan, modified into the Boric Plan, was presented to the United Nations, but rejected by the Soviet Union, which was secretly developing its own atomic bomb. Oppenheimer's advocacy for international control, his opposition to secrecy, and his public discussions of arms control made him suspect to military officials and anti-communist politicians who saw such positions as dangerously naive or even treasonous. As the Cold War intensified, Oppenheimer's political troubles grew. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb years earlier than American officials had predicted. The monopoly that was supposed to ensure American security for decades had lasted only 4 years. Political pressure mounted to develop even more powerful weapons. Edward Teller and others advocated for a crash program to build a hydrogen bomb, a super that would use atomic bombs as triggers to fuse hydrogen isotopes, potentially yielding explosions thousands of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Oppenheimer opposed this development, or at least urged caution. His opposition was complex, rooted partly in technical skepticism about whether the design would work, partly in strategic concerns that such weapons had no conceivable military purpose beyond genocide, and partly in moral revulsion. He chaired the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, which recommended against a crash hydrogen bomb program in October 1949. This recommendation was overruled by President Truman in January 1950, and the super program proceeded. This would prove to be a fatal mistake for Oppenheimer's career. His opposition to the hydrogen bomb made him enemies among nuclear weapons advocates, particularly Teller, who saw Oppenheimer's position as morally equivalent to disarmament in the face of Soviet threat. When the hydrogen bomb design was finally proven feasible and tested successfully in November 1952, those who had advocated for it felt vindicated, while Oppenheimer's caution seemed like obstruction. Furthermore, the political climate had shifted dramatically. Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusades were reaching their peak. Association with leftist causes, even decades earlier, could destroy careers and reputations. In November 1953, William Borden, former executive director of Congress's Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, sent a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, stating, "More probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union." This extraordinary accusation triggered a review of Oppenheimer's security clearance. The charges were not that he had committed espionage, no evidence of that ever emerged, but that his past communist associations, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, and his questionable judgment on security matters made him a security risk. In December 1953, Oppenheimer was called to Washington and presented with a letter detailing security concerns about him, his pre-war communist associations, his relationship with John Tatlock, his brother's party membership, contributions to leftist causes, and his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. He was given a choice: resign his consultancy positions with the government and quietly retire, or request a hearing to clear his name. Against the advice of friends, Oppenheimer chose to fight. "I can't believe what is happening to me," he said, but this was only the beginning of his ordeal. The hearing began in April 1954 in a temporary building in Washington. It was not a trial. Oppenheimer faced no criminal charges, but a personnel security hearing conducted by a 3-member panel of the Atomic Energy Commission. Yet it had all the characteristics of a trial. Oppenheimer was represented by lawyers. Witnesses testified for and against him. The proceedings, though officially classified, leaked extensively to newspapers, becoming a national spectacle. The government's case was prosecuted with unexpected ruthlessness. Roger Robb, the attorney questioning Oppenheimer, had access to FBI files and transcripts of Oppenheimer's intersected communications. Oppenheimer and his lawyers did not, violating normal due process. Robb systematically dissected every aspect of Oppenheimer's life: his pre-war politics, his relationships, his statements about the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer's own words, sometimes contradictory across decades, were used against him. His eloquence, once his strength, became a liability, as he tied himself in verbal knots trying to explain past statements and actions. Key witnesses testified against him, most devastatingly Edward Teller. When asked if Oppenheimer was loyal, Teller replied, "I believe, and that is merely a question of belief, and there is no expertness, no real information behind it. That Oppenheimer's character is such that he would not knowingly and willingly do anything that is designed to endanger the safety of this country. To the extent, therefore, that your question is directed toward intent, I would say I do not see any reason to deny clearance. If it is a question of wisdom and judgment, as demonstrated by actions since 1945, then I would say one would be wiser not to grant clearance." This carefully calibrated statement, technically defending Oppenheimer's loyalty while questioning his judgment, devastated Oppenheimer's case and destroyed his friendship with Teller. Many physicists never forgave Teller for this testimony. Other scientists testified in Oppenheimer's defense, praising his wartime leadership and his contributions to American security, but the outcome seemed predetermined. The hearing panel's majority recommended against restoring his security clearance. Their decision, announced in June 1954, effectively ended Oppenheimer's role in government policy. He could continue as director of the Institute for Advanced Study, but his influence on nuclear weapons policy, on arms control, on the political scientific interface he had come to dominate, was finished. The Oppenheimer hearing became a symbol of Cold War paranoia, McCarthyism's excesses, and the dangers of security theater. Many saw it as a show trial designed to punish Oppenheimer for his opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his advocacy of arms control. Oppenheimer himself was broken by the experience. The confident, charismatic leader who had directed Los Alamos became a prematurely aged, defeated man. He continued as Institute director until 1966, providing administrative leadership, but contributing nothing more to physics or policy. He chain-smoked, drank heavily, became increasingly withdrawn. The eloquence that had inspired scientists and charmed politicians gave way to long silences. In 1963, in a partial rehabilitation, President Lyndon Johnson awarded Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, the government's highest scientific honor. The award ceremony was poignant. Oppenheimer, gaunt and exhausted, accepted the honor from the government that had destroyed his career. 9 years earlier, Edward Teller was also present, having received the award previously. The two men did not speak. It was a bitter recognition that came too late to salvage his influence or repair his reputation. Oppenheimer died of throat cancer on February 18, 1967, at age 62. He was cremated and his ashes scattered at his beloved New Mexico ranch in the mountains where he had once ridden horses in his youth and where he had built the laboratory that changed the world. His wife Kitty survived him by 5 years, dying in 1972. Their daughter Toni, troubled throughout her life, committed suicide in 1977, continuing the pattern of tragedy that seemed to haunt Oppenheimer's family. The historical impact of J. Robert Oppenheimer is impossible to overstate. He led the scientific effort that created atomic weapons, thereby inaugurating the nuclear age and fundamentally altering international relations, military strategy, and the human condition. The weapons he helped create have never been used in war since 1945, but their existence has shaped every international crisis for 8 decades. The balance of terror they established arguably prevented World War III, but they also created the possibility of human extinction. Oppenheimer's legacy is deeply ambiguous. He was a brilliant scientist who made significant contributions to quantum mechanics and astrophysics. He was an inspired scientific leader who organized the Manhattan Project with extraordinary skill. He was a public intellectual who tried imperfectly to guide policy on the weapons he had created. He was also a man whose moral clarity failed at crucial moments, who participated in decisions that led to the incineration of 2 cities, who struggled with guilt and responsibility, but never fully confronted the implications of his work. His story raises profound questions about the relationship between scientific discovery and moral responsibility. Do scientists bear responsibility for how their discoveries are used? Can one serve one's country in wartime while maintaining moral autonomy? What obligations do intellectuals have to society? These questions, which Oppenheimer embodied but never fully answered, remain urgently relevant. In the decades since his death, Oppenheimer has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, plays, and films. He remains a symbol of the brilliant scientist whose work escapes his control, the intellectual destroyed by the political forces he tried to navigate, the man who achieved everything and lost everything. The Princeton Institute's archives house his papers, meticulously preserved. Historians continue to debate his motivations, his political commitments, his moral culpability. In 2022, the Department of Energy formally reversed the 1954 security clearance revocation, acknowledging that the hearing had been flawed and unfair. This belated vindication came 55 years after Oppenheimer's death, a final ironic footnote to a tragic life. Oppenheimer himself, in his later years, often quoted another passage from the Bhagavad Gita: "In battle, in forest, at the precipice, in the mountains, on the dark great sea, in the midst of javelins and arrows, in sleep, in confusion, in the depths of shame, the good deeds a man has done before defend him." Whether he believed his own deeds would defend him, whether he found peace with what he had wrought, remains unclear. He took those answers to his grave, scattered in the New Mexico desert, where he had unleashed the power of the sun. What do you think of J. Robert Oppenheimer? Was he a visionary who ended World War II and prevented greater bloodshed through deterrence? Or was he a Faustian figure who opened Pandora's box and bequeathed humanity the means of its own extinction? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.